Hey, everybody. I'm really happy my guest today is somebody I've known for a long time and greatly admired, somebody who worked on my campaign at a senior level. James R. Webb is a third generation Marine journalist, writer, and political consultant who has worked in the U.S. Senate and on political campaigns, including the 2024 presidential election for my campaign. Incidentally, uh, Jim's father is James Webb Jr., who served in the United States Senate, who was also in the Marine. And I think actually your family may be a third generation Marine, but I think you are in the military all the way back almost to the Revolutionary War. As I recall, I read your father's
That's correct.
biography, which is a fantastic book that I highly recommend. Was it
Thank you.
Born Fighting or Born to Fight? It was
Board fight.
Born Fighting, which I read it 20 years ago. In 2004, he spent a summer embedded with U.S. troops in Afghanistan. As a journalist, he then dropped out of Penn State and enlisted in the Marine Corps as an infantryman, serving 2005 to 2010 in Iraq. He served in Iraq. He fought at the Battle of Ramadi between 2006 and 2007 as part of a weapons company. Following the Marine Corps, he finished his college degree while working as a defense contractor. He also began writing opinion pieces for multiple outlets. Those caught the attention of Senator Rand Paul, who hired him in 2018 to work on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Senate Defense Veterans and Foreign Policy portfolios. In 2020, James stepped away from politics to focus full-time on writing. He wrote a lot about trout fishing in Missouri and other great subjects. He led coverage of the Afghan withdrawal and the resignation of Lieutenant Colonel Stu Scheller in 2022. He returned to politics as a campaign consultant for Senator Eric Schmidt of Missouri. Following Schmidt's successful election, Jim took a job in D.C.-based think tank focusing heavily on U.S. involvement in Ukraine. In 2023, he came to work for me and served as my senior advisor for my campaign on defense, foreign policy, and veterans policy. I heard you, I've always admired you, and, you played such a critical role in our campaign, just giving us extraordinary advice and insight. But I heard you on the Duran podcast, and,
Sure.
one of my kids asked me the other day what podcasts I consider indispensable. And if I had only one podcast that I would listen to, it would be the Duran podcast. I think anybody who wants to understand U.S. foreign policy, but also foreign policy, Alexander on that podcast is such an encyclopedic knowledge of,
Absolutely.
of politics around the globe in Latin America and Africa, in Asia and Russia and China. It's really quite breathtaking, and to me, it's just a joy to listen to. And I never miss any of his podcasts. I don't always agree with everything, but I would agree with probably 90% of the stuff that they say on there. And it's everything they say is brilliant. There's everything they say is just brilliant. But you were on there, and it was really one of the most. I think what your podcast should be mandatory that on Duran should be mandatory listening for every member of Congress, because you really kind of laid out these horrendous errors that we're making now in Ukraine, and that from a military point of view, from a military and strategic, how weak our Secretary of Defense and our Secretary of State are today. The enabling behavior that is encouraging this very, very corrupt Ukrainian regime to embroil us in a nuclear war, and that actually is their objective. Because and I've said this since the beginning of the war, that this war is unwinnable. It was crazy for them. They've convinced the American press that we're going to win this war. The American press parrots that propaganda. It would be like the United States losing a war to Cuba or losing a war to Mexico. It's not going to happen. It can never happen. This is a vital interest for Russia. It is a critical interest for Russia. It is not critical to anything of the United States. It's not a treaty partner. We have zero political or strategic interest in the Ukraine. The Russians have been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time they were invaded, Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. For them, it's absolutely critical. And if NATO moves into Ukraine, we will be able to put Tomahawk missiles and other missile systems 4 minutes from Moscow. We can decapitate the entire Soviet leadership. That's not good for our country. It's not good for the world because it destabilizes everything. And the Russians are correct in wanting to keep that out of there, just like we would want to keep missiles out of Cuba.
100%.
But the Zelensky strategy, since he knows he can't win, he's making these foolhardy and reckless gestures that are calculated to bring NATO into the war, which is the only way they can triumph. It's a full-scale World War III, United States against Russia. That's the only way Ukraine can prevail. And that's his strategy, and we're letting him do it. And yesterday, the New York Times reported that the Biden administration is considering, giving medium and long range permission for Ukraine to use medium and long range missiles to hit targets directly in Russia, which is insane. So let's talk about that, and then let's talk first about the Kursk offensive and how that came about. And I love what Alexander says. It was a trap. It was a Russian military trap, and you make that case too. Again, you have the international press saying the salient by Ukraine into Russia is a sign of the victory and the strength of Ukraine. It's actually the opposite. And explain that.
Sure. Well, first, Mr. Kennedy, thank you so much for having me on your show. One of the primary reasons I wanted to work for you in the first place is your courageous, stand on the war. It really separated you from all the other candidates, and I wish that things had turned out differently in terms of your candidacy for the presidency. We need really sane leadership in Washington, particularly on foreign policy right now. And I hope that President Trump rolls you in somewhere where you can make a difference, particularly on that issue. And it's great to see you again. Absolutely great to see you again. So in terms of Kursk being a trap, there's a couple of things that you need to look at, on the ground, precursors that led up to it. And also, you have to take into account the Russian way of war, which is far different than the way the United States fights. They have shown historically, going back to Napoleon, the Mongols, there's a counter argument for this, that they were penetrated by these forces, or the Germans who rolled in, say that, hey, they were weak and they took ground, but they've proven historically to cede ground in order to buy time for their own forces, stretch logistics lines, and kind of have the terrain eat the opposing force over a period of time. Secondly, you have to look at the way the Russians fight wars generally, specifically, in the case of what they have declared that they're doing to the Ukrainian military, which is, their objective has not been to seize ground in Ukraine. You can take a look at, perhaps Crimea or Donetsk as a couple of regions that they wanted to take, but that's primarily because those regions are full of Russian-speaking people. It's 90+% in those areas. They view those as part of their diaspora, for lack of a better term. And the final point to take a look at is, what were the precursors to this invasion? The key indicator that this was a trap, in fact, designed to suck the Ukrainians in, was that they demined the areas directly in front of where the Ukrainian forces came across. And you can say, oh, okay, well, maybe that's a target of opportunity for the Ukrainians. It's a bold stroke. But that belies the fact that the Russians have electronic warfare or EW dominance, and I'm probably going to say that phrase a bunch of times while we're sitting here because it's a big deal. In that area, they can target a cell phone within seconds that turns on wherever they have their, say, EW bubble. They intercept all communications. They know what's going on. And the closer you get to Russia proper, the more dominant that becomes. Another factor in this
let
is
me just
taking a
talk
look
about
at.
that
Yes,
for
sir.
a second, because the Russians really are a generation ahead of us in electronic warfare.
Absolutely.
And we don't acknowledge this. They have 1,000, 1,200 more nuclear missiles than we do. They have a defensive weapons systems that are much better than anything that we have.
Correct.
And, my son fought in the Ukraine. I don't know if you know this. My son Connor joined the Foreign Legion, and he fought for a special forces group in the Ukraine. And the first part of his service, he was a drone operator. He later became a machine gunner. And as a drone operator, that was the most dangerous assignment that you could have, because the second you turned on that drone, the Russians knew exactly where you were. And at that point, it was really an artillery war. He had firefights at night with the Russians at closer quarters. Most of it was an artillery war. And as soon as you turned on that drone, they would send a missile over that would kill everything within 300 feet.
Right.
And Connor's job was to get the drone into the air very quickly. He would sit in the back of a pickup truck, and then the pickup truck would start moving as soon as he got that drone operating, so that it was a moving target that was harder to hit. But, it was very frightening and very, very, very dangerous. And the Russians have this capacity now, these electronic warfare capacities that are very much more sophisticated than what we have.
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to
Oh
interrupt.
no, that's absolutely true, and it's something the United States military hasn't run into serious artillery since probably the Vietnam War, and the last 20 years that we fought in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, we were fighting mainly insurgents, and we had the advantage, and it didn't take much to disrupt them or to figure out their communications. We've been on the forefront, I guess you could say, contextually to our situation. The Russians have been working at the conventional fight for a long time, and they've honed these skills in the last couple of years against Ukrainians out of basically pure necessity. And when you roll that into where they are now and what they've been trying to do with the Ukrainians in a strategic or operational sense, they're trying to wrap up what has been going on in the Donbass. They want the Donbass. It's one of these, it's the last remaining real Russian-speaking area that they have to take. And within that, they have a very stubborn defender. When you go into offensive operations against an enemy, you want at least a 3 to 4 to 1 advantage if you're just launching any kind of conventional attack against whomever. It's way harder when you're out in the open to take ground, to lay suppressing fire, basically just to survive. And as an attacker, that puts you naturally at a disadvantage no matter how technologically advanced or how good you are at your job. So if you look back at really any fight, you can go back to the Civil War, you can go back to the French and Indian War, where my family started fighting on behalf of America. The key is to bring a stubborn defender out of the defense. And I believe, and I think it's really apparent with the situation on the ground right now, that the Russians recognize an opportunity to draw the Ukrainians out. I'm going to go in a little bit of conjecture here, but I think it adds up when you start looking at the ground truth, that they saw the Ukrainians trying to open up another front, to try and get the Russian mass in the Donbass to move somewhere else so that they could solidify their defense there. And the Russians, with a counterstroke, recognized that and in effect allowed them to walk in. And in the middle of this, they allowed them to invade the Kursk region. And kind of what is the Kursk region or the Kursk Oblast in in Russia. It reminds me a lot of, I used to live in the Ozarks in Missouri, and it's generally uninhabited. It's rolling terrain, kind of mountainous. Kursk has about, I think it's 5,000 miles of rivers and streams, and each one of those is, it's a pain if you're attacking. It's a gift if you're in the defense because it slows your attacker down, and it's either densely forested or it's wide open cleared forest that has become, arable farmland in the area. Another key component of this is the fact that in the entire oblast, which is roughly, it's roughly the size of Missouri, I think actually it's a little bit bigger, there's only about 1 million people. So there's not a lot of risk to, the Russian people proper, and it can be easily evacuated. And it's kind of the perfect battle space in which to have a conventional fight. And as they let the Ukrainians come in, the Ukrainians very, very much use Western style tactics, using Western equipment. It's in effect, what remains of the cadre that had been trained by NATO. And at the same time, the remainder of all of our really good equipment. They used Strikers, Bradleys, you kind of name it, the hodgepodge of different really high end Western gear to penetrate through the Russian defenses, which largely turned out were border guards. Can you imagine what would happen if the Mexican military, which is not very good, put a force up against the Customs and Border Patrol? They're just not equipped to do anything with it. And they strung the Ukrainians out. The Ukrainians had 2 or 3 routes which they could go through, and at each key point in terrain, they offloaded their vehicles and they seized it, which is a fundamental piece of American doctrine, quite frankly. And you can see we did that very effectively invading Iraq in 2003. And the idea behind it is you get through the defenses with your armor, you get behind your defender, and then the infantry kind of creeps up and mops up. What the Russians did in response, and this was a very key indicator to me that this was in fact a trap, is they didn't meet them with a large force. They let them come in. They used their indirect fire assets, airstrikes, drones, artillery, to systematically eliminate the equipment that was on the ground, which provided mobility for the Ukrainians, and left the infantry out there to just kind of die on the vine, if you will, to borrow a term from MacArthur in the Second World War. And that's due to the fact that your average infantryman hasn't been able to carry more than about 100 pounds for the last 1,000 years. And in today's context, you're carrying about 40 to 50 pounds of body armor, and that's half your load. Then you need to carry water, food, ammo, and the rest of it. And so you're looking at your average guy having about, I don't know, maybe 1,000 rounds in 3 to 4 days of water and food. And that is not going to get it done. And as we've seen, after the initial success of the Ukrainians going in, which my take, and I believe it's Alexander's take, is that, they were just let in to do what they wanted to do. They ran out of space to move. They were fixed in position. They came under overwhelming indirect fire. And now you have a couple of different flanks collapsing under the weight of a massive Russian counterattack. And I forgot to mention this on the front end. It should be noted that that was the avenue which had been identified previously, as the site for a potential Russian counterattack. Ukrainians had been reporting the Russians had been massing in that area, and when they launched their attack, nobody was home. However, those forces, apparently are still there. And I followed this exceptionally closely for a number of years, and it appears that only 1 battalion from the Russian military has been moved from Donbass up into Kursk. And it's an elite battalion of Russian airborne troops, which have been sent in to prosecute the initial phases of this attack. So, the Ukrainian plan didn't work. They're finding themselves incredibly outnumbered. And the key part of this is the fact that it is the remainder of their best guys who are trapped up there, and it looks like, to me at least, there's one main supply route that is remaining for them to leave, and they're going to have to walk out, if they want to survive. You can't describe that in any sense as a success, at all, and there's probably 10 to 15,000. This is based off of some unfortunately sketchy reporting Ukrainians who were trapped up there on foot. And we could talk about this in a second, but you talk about sketchy reporting, and that's kind of the basis of the entire conflict here in the West. That everybody's understanding, at least, is nobody here in America really has a real concrete understanding of what's going on. We're hearing every single day that this is a great success and that the Ukrainians are defending brilliantly, which I'm not taking it away from them. It takes incredible gumption to get up there when you're outnumbered and continue to do it. But the reality is they've taken horrendous casualties doing this, and it's in effect wiping out, large segments of their population. And I find that as a former infantryman, absolutely terrifying, this kind of war. But as an American, it's pretty grotesque that we have been enabling this to go on, like you said on the beginning of the show here.
Yeah, and the background, the strategic background is that that the Russians have been steadily advancing, despite the U.S. propaganda, into Donbass and Lugansk, and taking apart the particularly with the deployment of these glide bombs, have been dismantling and taking apart systematically, little by little,
right,
at an accelerating rate, the defenses and the lines, the Ukrainian lines appear to be deteriorating, and the Ukrainian strategy, and they keep telling us different stories about why they did this. But originally, the original story was they made this salient into Russia because they believed that the Russians would then have to divert some of their troops from Donbass and Lugansk to deal with this. But the Russians didn't do that. As you said, it was one unit. It's only one unit that's been moved over there. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians put their best men, their NATO-trained forces, the cream of all their forces into Donbass and Lugansk. And it appears, like you said, it was a trap. And incidentally, is the same strategy that Stalin used and his generals used
100%.
in World War II in the original Battle of Kursk, where they did the exact same thing. They sucked the Germans in and then cut them off and destroyed their equipment and then rolled up the infantry with horrendous with millions of men dead. Millions of men, Germans dead, and it broke the back of Hitler.
They did this. They've done this a number of times. You can go back to the Napoleonic Wars for examples, concrete examples of it, but specifically what you're talking about with the Second World War, it happened twice, right? The first was Stalingrad, where they got the German Sixth Army to completely commit itself to fighting inside the city. The Germans protected their flanks with largely Italian and Romanian troops who did not have the combat capability or the will to fight. And in one quick stroke, at the point at which they recognized that the German army, was at its most vulnerable, was the furthest into the city it could get, they struck from the flanks, trapped and eliminated 250,000 German troops. The following, what you're talking about here specifically with Kursk, what is now, I guess, the first Battle of Kursk in 1943, the Germans once again massed the absolute cream of their army a little bit further to the northeast of where this action's taking place. And they launched an offensive into a defense in depth that the Russians had set up, or the Soviets at the time had set up. And once the Germans had once again reached the absolute depth of that defense, that the Soviets felt that they were the most vulnerable, Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive. And in the process, eliminated, this is the parallel I like to draw with the current situation, is they eliminated the core of the equipment that was available to the German army. The German armored divisions never recovered, and they found themselves outnumbered on the battlefield without the equipment to support the infantry on the ground. And it was just a steady rollback, all the way to Berlin. And this gets into another point you mentioned about the actions in Donbass, where what the Germans are probably what the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians right now is, it's contrary to Western understanding in terms of doctrine. We have mission-based tactics, which focuses, to boil it down to your viewers, it's capture the flag, where, you have the objective, you punch in, you seize the objective, you finish the operation.
That's what we
The
did.
Russians,
That's what we did in Baghdad, right?
absolutely,
We had
absolutely, and it worked. It worked in the short term. It didn't really work in the long term. But with the Russians right now, they're not launching, a big aero offensive, as some people like to call it, which would be, say the capture of Baghdad. They're moving incrementally and using the weight of their firepower and the weight of their now manpower advantage, which is in some cases 10, 12 to 1, and completely inverted from the beginning of this conflict, by the way, just to continue to pressure the Ukrainians. And then every now and then they'll launch a localized offensive, seize a little bit better terrain, and then rinse and repeat. And that gets into what Putin said at the beginning of this war, which is, his objective is not to take Kiev. His objective is not to take the rest of Europe. It's to eliminate the Ukrainians as a threat to his border. And the best way to do that is to, in effect, kill off the military or force them to quit and disarm them. And that's always been the two options that the Ukrainians have. It's either a negotiated settlement where we can say, hey, we're basically done with this. Or the other option is to render them completely incapacitated. And the disgusting thing about that is that we continue to push this forward and enable them to hang around on the battlefield long enough just to continue to die. And it really needs to stop.
Yeah, I have so many questions for you, but one of the questions I think everybody has, we don't really know what the comparative kill ratios are. Some I've heard as much as 5 to 1. In other words, that the Russians are killing 5, because this is now a war of attrition.
Right.
And the Russians have a lot more people than Ukraine. Ukraine's 40 million people. The Russians are, close to 200 million, right? And so they have a lot more access to troops, and it's become a war of attrition. But the Ukrainians will not release their casualty numbers.
Right.
And the estimates are as high as 600,000 or 700,000 dead. And that the Russian kill ratios are from 2 to 1. In other words, for every Russian that dies, there's 2 Ukrainian troops who die, to 5 to 1. So, just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. I think, I don't think your assessment is that far off. I like to go with it's 500,000 dead. What's 100, 200,000 at that point? It's a bad, cynical joke. But you're completely correct. And the ratios, who knows what the ratios are? I believe Media Zona has gone out there and done a number of assessments. They tried to, in effect, parody, turn into a parody the Russian official estimate or releases on their own dead, but then back that up with doing, satellite photography, taken death notices out of the papers, and they came back with basically the same amount that the Russian Ministry of Defense, had put out. Does that include, folks like Wagner, or perhaps, not conscripted, but, people who are in effect penal battalions pulled out of prisons? I'm unsure about that, but that number can't be too far off. But the best place to look, if you want to take a look at Ukrainian casualties, is to bring up or to take a look at the rounds of conscription they're on. It's you have officially, I believe it's between 20 and 25,000 admitted dead from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. The last time they updated that was the first couple of months of the war. But you have the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th round of conscription. It seems like every couple of months they're trying to muster another couple 100,000 guys out of the population, dropping the age at which people can be drafted lower and lower, and continuing to hollow out their society. And the needle's not moving, and if you start to read The Economist, The Washington Post, Newsweek, Time Magazine, CNN, any of these places that were so hard over on supporting this to begin with, you're starting to see the mask slip a little bit, where all of these units in the front line are talking about how they're undermanned by as much as 75%. The Russians now outnumber them, 8 to 1, 9 to 1, 10 to 1 in different battle spaces. And it's a real indicator that they're straight up not producing, or they don't have enough manpower to field an army at this point. And the only way with a conscripted army like theirs that you don't have the manpower is if you're out of guys. And it's pretty eerie when you slow down and start to think about it.
Yeah, now the neocon dream was to do this war in order to weaken Russia and to get rid of
Hmm.
Putin. And the irony is that Putin is now stronger than ever. His economy is stronger, more resilient. He's profited actually by figuring out ways to live without the in under the pressure of all these
Right.
embargoes and sanctions against Russia. It's actually made them sturdier, more self-sufficient. Putin is more popular than he's ever been. He's extraordinary
Hmm.
popularity. The economy is strong. Inflation is low. The national debt is one of the lowest in the world.
Hmm.
Everything in Russia is essentially prospering. And Russia is getting stronger militarily. They've rebuilt their industrial base. And I remember Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense in April of 2022, was asked, why are we in this war? And he said, to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to operate anywhere in the world. Well, the war's done exactly the opposite. It's made them stronger.
Absolutely.
It's pushed them into this very dangerous alliance with China. China has the best industrial base in the world, and Russia has some
Hmm.
of the best technology, the best warfare technology in the world. They have, as I said, more nuclear missiles than we do. They're larger nuclear power, the largest nuclear power in the world. But they're also weakening America, not only economically, but also this has given them the opportunity to figure out how to how to resist Americans' high-tech weaponry. And they've broken
Hmm.
the code on many of our best weapons and figured out ways
Absolutely.
around it, figures around them. Talk about that.
Sure. And I'll talk about that. There's 2 points. You hit on a great point, which is the Russians in effect realigning how they do trade, and how they are making money internationally. And if you look at the rise of BRICS and what their relationship is with OPEC Plus now, this is a response to our response. It's an international response to our response to the conflict in Ukraine, where there's a number of countries. We've pushed Russia and China into a de facto military alliance if they don't already have a piece of paper signed between the two of them, where they're sharing technology. The Chinese are undoubtedly testing their equipment on the battlefield and refining it with each other. And then you have the economic part where we like to, if you pay attention to the Senate, I worked there for a number of years. Everybody loves to brag about, the aggressive sanctions that we're placing on different countries. Those only work if they're completely, unilateral. Everybody has to be on board. Otherwise, you're just closing a market and you're shifting the market somewhere else. A byproduct of our sanctions on Russia has been to sanction the Chinese defense industry. And there have been a number of protests which have gone underreported here in the US media from the Chinese about that. And I'm not saying, necessarily whether China or Russia is a good actor, but that's something you should pay attention to, because both of them are ignoring, what we're trying to do and increasingly working with each other out of necessity. And you have Russia as the largest possessor of natural resources in the world, working hand in hand with China now, who is the number one industrial economy in the world. And those goods and services are going back and forth, unhindered, and making both countries, more profitable and closing markets to the United States left and right. When you start talking about technology, and this is something I wrote about last year, specifically around HIMARS, is that that any kind of technology you have on the battlefield has a very very short half life. The machine gun, for example, in World War One was it was state of the art. Nobody knew what to do with it, but within a few months of the war, and that was combined with kind of advanced modern artillery, backing it up, everybody understood, how to subvert it, right? They dug back into the ground. You had the advent of tanks. You had aircraft become more prevalent. It became less of a death dealer. With our technology, 100% of our technology that came out of the 80s and 90s, which is on display in Russia right now, and yeah, it's in Russia, unfortunately, but mostly in Ukraine, was designed to fight the Soviet army. It's supposed to be kind of like our trump card, right, on the battlefield. Bradleys, the M1 Abrams tank, long-range artillery, the HIMARS system, ATACMS missiles, which are now being threatened to be fired deep into Russia. All of these things were designed to give us the initial edge in a confrontation. And when employed properly and in mass, the way they're supposed to be done by professionals in our military, it retains an edge and saves American lives in the event that some kind of conflict occurs. Unfortunately, what we've done is we've handed all of these systems off in piecemeal fashion to what is in effect a Ukrainian military, which by comparison is amateurish to ours, and more importantly, has absolutely nothing to do with our own national security or our own national interest. And we've exposed them in bits and pieces to the Russian military's electronic warfare systems, to their battlefield commanders. And we have what Raytheon tells us or Northrop Grumman tells us about the actual capabilities of these systems. And then you have the Russians on the back end who are dealing with, the results of them and adjusting appropriately. And I believe it's every 6 weeks they figure something out. And if you go and take a look at the HIMARS system, which we initially deployed to Ukraine, I believe it was about 18 months ago, it was pretty effective right out of the gate. These what I think 4 to 12, I don't know the exact number, but it was a handful, were effective at hitting Russian logistic sites. And almost immediately there was an adjustment made, which will then be applied if we're ever in a conflict with anybody who they support and we don't like. And that comes down to a couple different things. Like one, like how do you prevent, an effective HIMARS strike just at a tactical level, like by spacing your people out. But more importantly, we are completely reliant on GPS, and Russian EW has been adapted to interfere with that, and it's rendered everything from missiles to bombs falling from the sky, or guided bombs, to being, I wouldn't say completely ineffective, but to a degree where it doesn't give us an edge anymore.
So there now, we have essentially handed to Russia the capability to counter our frontline weapon systems that were supposed to protect American troops in the case of a large conflict with a large country like Russia or China or Iran, for example. Now those countries all know our best secrets. They know how to counter them, and we've now lost our primary battlefield advantage. And it's worth saying that during World War II, we were the arsenal of the world because we had this extraordinary industrial base. We had the steel, the ball bearings, the automobile companies that were quickly repurposed to build airplanes, jets, a ship a day. I mean, airplanes, tanks, a ship a day, etc. We no longer have an industrial base. We've outsourced that to China. So China now has the industrial base that can be repurposed. One company in China makes 75% of the drones in the world. And they're way ahead of us in drone technology, which is the weapon of the future. Both of them have these hypersonic weapons that we have not been able to master. They have extraordinary, so we keep assuming that we have the big weapons arsenal and we're the big on it because we spend all the money on it. But actually, they are arguably much better prepared for a war than we are. And
Absolutely.
And we can't get troops across the Atlantic anymore. It's really the assumptions that President Biden has been making about this war that I don't even know what. I know that Vice President Harris is very naive about U.S. capability, military capability. Very confident, very belligerent, very bellicose, very pugnacious. having no idea about the failures over the past decade of the U.S. military, and what that says about our capacity, and our capacity to bluff the world is now disappeared.
Absolutely.
Because they've shown what they can do against the top line U.S. weapons. It's really been a disaster for the U.S. military fighter, our military personnel, because we've given away the systems that were supposed to protect them and to minimize their body counts.
Absolutely. And there's like two points. Like, one, it's kind of cynical. I would think that Kamala Harris's greatest foreign policy achievement as vice president was to convince the Russians to cross the border. If you remember back, I think it was the day before the Russians went across the start line, she was at a conference with NATO and stated that Ukraine will be part of NATO, and was bragging about it and laughing about it, in her typical cackle. And the next day, boom, the Russians went across the line, because that has always been their red line. They could not have a hostile nation directly on their border. They've always wanted a buffer. And if you literally translate Ukraine, or the Ukraine, it means the borderlands. It's the buffer. And as you said at the beginning of the shows, 3 invasions now have come through that territory. And the missile systems, which we were going to provide, should they be in NATO, which is called the Aegis Ashore. It's something I worked on pretty heavily in the Senate. It would have been, in these areas they're fighting right now. And it's 3 to 4 minutes to Moscow. If you go to the website for Aegis Ashore, I believe it's a Raytheon product. It's billed as a defensive system, but right on the front of the website it says, hey, a quick software update turns this offensive, and it could launch nuclear tipped missiles, to which the Russians would have absolutely, no chance to respond to. And we nearly, went to war with Cuba over something far less menacing. It's really unfortunate. And when it comes to the weapon systems, you would hope that we would be in a position to respond, to update this, but we don't have the know-how or the understanding of this next generation of Russian systems that's coming out. I had the opportunity in 2019 to visit Fort Campbell and a couple of the units there, and whose 5th Special Forces Group is based there. And they had just come back from Syria, and they were showing me what is still the current U.S. Kamikaze drone. It's called a Switchblade, which is proven, by the way, completely ineffective in the battle space in Ukraine. And also, it hasn't been updated. However, what the Russians have done is they're on their 2nd or 3rd generation of suicide drones, which allegedly, big air quote, allegedly have AI capabilities. But regardless, they own the skies with these. They're producing them at a ratio that the Ukrainians can't keep up with. We won't even approach. And it's not good. We're way behind. But, one more point is that basic artillery that we use every day on the battlefield, I believe we're producing, I think it's tens of thousands of rounds per month, where the Russians are expending millions of rounds per month. And we can't keep up with that either. And no one's really looking at this. We've tipped our hand.
Yeah. Well, it's a sad thing for our country, and it's very, very frightening to think that Kamala Harris may be our commander-in-chief with the absolute dearth of any kind of knowledge or instinct or curiosity about history, about the uses of power, about the reality on the ground. It's all sort of deep state propaganda, and it's very, very, very sad for our country. And that's one of the reasons that I'm in this fight right now, is that I think at all costs that has to end, because we'll end up in a new game. The Russians have already changed their first strike policies. Mm-hmm. They warned us that they were going to do that. They said, they up until now, they've always said we will never use a nuclear weapon in a first strike, a preemptive strike. And now they've said we may do it. They changed that specifically in reaction these attacks on their soil. I mean,
Mhm.
what the Russians were saying from the beginning is this is not a territorial land grab. We have this comic book depiction saying, oh yeah,
Right.
he's like Hitler. He's trying to march across Europe. And they were very clear from the beginning. This has nothing to do with the territorial. We don't want the territory. We want security. This is a security issue for us. It is not territorial. We don't want the Ukraine, or we don't want Ukraine. We want our security. We want our national security. And the U.S. has ignored that legitimate security needs of Russia, and treated it, these comic book depictions about what's really happening there, and
Right.
it's very, very dangerous for the whole world. And
Right. And
just talk for a second about that, about the changes in because we also had 2 nuclear weapons treaties, missile treaties with the Russians that we unilaterally walked away from.
Absolutely.
It's so
There's
crazy what we're doing.
It is. It is. And it gets back to, only thing I can really liken it to is it's hubris. It's the hubris of Washington. They keep it's commonplace to refer to Russia as a gas station with nukes, and they're not. They are a historic empire. They've had ebbs and flows. They deserve, that we don't have to be their friend. We don't have to think that they're our friend, but you have to treat them with the respect that we also, request from other nations. And that's not happening. And when you look at, potentially what is going to be happening with if it's not already done, the green light to use deep strike capabilities into Russia, that is absolutely terrifying. It doesn't need to happen, primarily because it's not going to change anything on the battlefield. Their Ukrainian justification is twofold. I believe it was the spokesman for their foreign minister said that, Russia or Putin has said that he has red lines. They've always been ignored. Therefore, there are no red lines and we have nothing to worry about. And the second thing that comes out of his mouth is that we are going to hit airfields and supply hubs and troop concentrations, which are going to enable us to do things on the battlefield. And quite frankly, that's bunk. They have capabilities. They have other airfields. They've already pulled most of their aircraft back out of the range of these systems. So, and no matter how many of these missiles you lob into Russia, you're not going to be able to take out the necessary amount of equipment and manpower to make a difference, particularly when the Ukrainian losses are so high. And to think that we can change that with a limited number of missiles is absolutely ludicrous. I've seen estimates where we have maybe 1,000 of these left in our own inventory. They're not easy to make. They're very sensitive. It takes time, and we need them for ourselves. So, if we have 1,000 left in our inventory, if we have 2,000 left in our inventory, how many are we really going to give them? And how many of those is it going to take if you really wanted to take down the entire Russian military with a system like that, which is not possible, but it would take far more of these than we even possess or could make in the near future. And the only thing it's really going to do is inflame tensions. And Putin is already on the record saying that if they start launching them, then we are in a state of war. And what that means,
a war with NATO and the United
correct.
States.
Mm-hmm.
And you have these real, I got to call them like children, emotional children and intellectual children, Anthony Blinken, Sullivan in Washington. And they're saying, we're calling his bluff. We poked the bear 6 times and he didn't do anything, so we're going to poke him 6 more times. And Putin until now has been acting with extraordinary restraint. And Russia, unlike our country, is sensitive to the opinion of other nations. And, Putin has been saying from the beginning, this is about our security. It's about our right not to be invaded and intruded on. And now Ukraine has done the very thing that he predicted, which is they've invaded Russia. They've used NATO equipment and NATO approval and NATO training to actually invade Russia. And now we're going to attack Russia with missiles, and all of the rest of the world is looking at this and saying, okay, Russia, we get it. You acted with restraint. You did what you needed to do. These people are completely unreasonable. They're utterly out of control. And you need to do what you need to do to protect your territorial integrity. And the world is giving him now permission to use nuclear weapons. And he said he's going to do it. And we have these really insane people in Washington who know nothing about history or foreign policy or about the uses of power. And they are leading America into destruction.
I wouldn't give them so much credit, Mr. Kennedy, as saying they're leading anybody. I think what they're doing is they're cowards. You have a client state in effect of Ukraine, which is telling you what to do. And that is not how this is supposed to work. We are the senior partner in this relationship, and somebody in government should have the gumption to stand up and assert that. And it should not be controversial. Like, whose feelings are you going to really hurt if you're saying, I'm looking out for the American people? The second part of it is when you start taking a look at, what could potentially the response be? I don't think that, and I would hope not, that Putin would not go directly to nukes. There's always the potential you start playing with fire, you're going to get burned. But there's any number of ways that he could respond, which could absolutely be destructive to the United States. And when you take a look at the transparent fact, we've admitted this in print, that everything that has to do with targeting, when the Ukrainians are firing these different platforms into Russia, when they're planning their offensive like Kursk, when they're planning their failed counterattack in the southern part of the country last year, it all comes from Washington. It all comes from American advisors, and everything but actually pushing the button on these things is done by Americans or NATO advisors. And the most critical vulnerability we have is the GPS system in America. Everything from your cell phone to how a missile flies through the air is tied to this. I don't particularly know. I'm good with ground combat, but I don't know how space works, or what the Russian capabilities are up there. But if I was them and I really, really wanted to deal a non-lethal blow short of nuclear war, that's where I would go, because you could take our economy offline in about 10 minutes. And it's something we shouldn't even have to think about.
The other thing they could do is cut the transatlantic cables and shut down the entire global banking system. And they're invulnerable because they've been cut off from the banking system. They've had to develop a parallel system. And it would be excusable because we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline to cripple their economy. Like you said, they don't have to use nuclear weapons. They can bring down our country, destroy our economy overnight with a lot of different non-conventional approaches to warfare that are available to them today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a reality that I would hope that people in Washington, as they continue to barrel into a really terrible scenario, consider. But I don't have any confidence they're doing it, because if they were, you wouldn't be hearing that we're even considering allowing the Ukrainians to do this. I could allow the argument for this kind of employment of weaponry if it was truly going to make a difference on the battlefield in a scenario which was in the core national interest of the United States. Neither one of those are true. So what the heck are we doing? Like, in all reality, like what is this? Like, why are we doing this? Other than the fact that, perhaps there are some in Washington who really do want to see this. And you have people like Victoria Nuland and Hillary Clinton, where this is the last gasp for their ultimately totally failed color revolution scheme, from Egypt to Syria, to
everything
the Ukraine and beyond.
Failed.
Absolutely.
Everything.
And this is the last one that's still going. It has any life. And in terms of their own legacy, if this completely falls off the table, what do they have left? They're disgrace. I mean, they're already a disgrace, but the ego that's involved it's beyond evil, because they're extinguishing hundreds of thousands of lives, and they're risking hundreds of millions of more lives just for the sake of their own personal aims and self-gratification. That's the only way I can rationalize this.
Yeah. All right. I'd like to talk to you for another 4 hours, but thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, no problem. I appreciate it.
Really good to see you.
You too, Mr.
I'll see you again soon.
All right, well, Ukraine's dirty little secret is now out of the bag. 600,000 Ukrainian men have been killed in that war. That, by the way, is a conservative number. I've spoken to military brass that believe it's well over 700,000 dead. And the Biden administration is aware that Ukraine is about to fall to Russia unless it puts NATO boots on the ground to fill the ranks of dead soldiers. Some shit is about to hit the fan. And over the past few days, Poland, NATO, have amassed tens of thousands of soldiers along the Polish border with Ukraine. Why? That's because something big is coming. Poland, of course, worried that they are about to be invaded by tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees. You saw what happened at the beginning of the war when that country was changed forever as a result of millions of Ukrainian refugees that landed in that country. Many, of course, have now returned, but now the concern is that they would flood the border. Now, Zelensky this morning, the authoritarian ruler of Ukraine, Zelensky this morning slammed the United States, slammed the West, and demanded once again a NATO no-fly zone over Ukraine. This is something he's been asking for years. He called on NATO to stop sitting on the sidelines, start shooting down Russian aircraft, start shooting down Russian drones. He also said that the Western countries are too concerned about escalating the conflict. Yeah, we're concerned about starting World War III. We don't want a nuclear confrontation with Russia. Imagine that. Basically calling us wimps who are worried about World War III. We're wimps. Go ahead, Phil.
So sorry, real quick. Where does he think World War III is going to take place? Where is it going to start? If he's got a problem with Russia invading Ukraine, what happens when everybody is fighting in Ukraine? Like that doesn't make things better.
I don't think he thought that through.
And I don't think he much cares, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't think he much cares that his own country, of course, has been used now as a massive aircraft carrier to begin with. All the land is sold off to BlackRock, and
most Ukrainian men have been conscripted. In fact, just today, Ukraine said it found 16 men in a meat freezer trying to escape the draft. He does not care about the lives of his people. I am very comfortable saying that declaratively.
Yeah.
He's an asshole.
So he's calling us wimps who are worried about World War III. And of course, we're wimps and we will likely do his bidding because that's what we've done so far. The United States has done his bidding, even though it's taken a few months to do it. F-16s, we're not going to do it. Okay, we'll do it. All the weapons you want, HIMARS, yeah, we'll do it. We'll do all of it. Because, after all, we just do your bidding. Just like we'll do Israel's bidding, by the way. Netanyahu says that the United States must join Israel to combat Iran. So we're going to do all of these things, and we're going to send soldiers. The Biden administration has been laying the groundwork to bring back a draft in the United States in order to fight Russia and Iran simultaneously. I just saw someone in our Rumble chat who just said, where in the Constitution does it mention a conscription of American service members? Where in the Constitution? Point me to it. I'd love to see that in the U.S. Constitution. Military experts are telling the Mockingbird media that, by the way, that sending tanks and F-16s to Ukraine is not enough. Manpower, boots on the ground is the only way to win. They need the manpower to man these weapons. No amount of drones is going to win this thing. And Ukraine is in dire straits right now. Ukraine's last-ditch failed offensive over the past 48 hours into Russia officially collapsed this morning, not too long before our show just started, leaving 300 Ukrainians dead. And Vladimir Putin commented on this move into the Kursk region. Ukraine launched attacks on civilians in Kursk, hitting homes. They targeted ambulances and other civilian areas, but that has now collapsed. And Russia stopped that advance. Russian President Putin just speaking a short time ago on this advance in the Kursk region. Listen.
I have to begin with the developments in the Kursk region. As we know, the Kiev regime is making another large-scale provocation, shooting indiscreetly, using all kinds of weaponry, including missile weaponry, targeting civilian buildings,
ambulances, homes, civilian infrastructure. As Moon of Alabama points out today, in 1943, during World War II, the German attack on Kursk was launched for a similar reason, to try to divert Russian forces away from attacking in the Donetsk region. It ended in utter defeat. So basically trying to distract Russian forces up in Kursk instead of down in Donetsk in the Donbass. Even pro-Ukrainian commentators who love Ukraine, are all about the Ukrainian side of the war, are shocked at how stupid this move was. Again, as Moon of Alabama posted, a total waste of men and resources. Here's what the commenter writes. The situation in the Pokrovsk direction is critical, with defenses in several areas collapsed. And yet to stabilize largely due to a shortage of personnel, diverting nearly a brigade to launch an assault on the Kursk Oblast, which lacks strategic sense, and it borders on mental disability. Basically calling Ukrainian military officials mentally unstable, mentally disabled at this point. But more importantly, we just got some stunning news over the past few days out of Ukraine. And this is really stunning. According to a new report, the Ukrainian armed forces have been drafting around 30,000 troops monthly since May. Now, on the face of it, you say, how's that possible? They have no men left, right? How is that possible? Well, this is a staggering number and a clear indication of the dire straits in which Ukraine finds itself. Well, the New York Times separately confirmed this number. Ukraine ramps up mobilization, hoping to bolster battlefield strength. So where is this? How is this happening? Well, this isn't just like some amazing mainstream narrative like, wow, these men are just lining up to volunteer. No, these men are not just deciding to enlist to fight against Russia. Ukraine's conscription law now makes it mandatory. Of course, that was passed just recently. And also, you'll recall that Ukraine also tried to block you from seeing videos like this. If you take videos of these conscription body snatchers grabbing men off the streets and throwing them into paddy wagons and taking them off to the front lines, if you live in Ukraine, social media police will come to your house. You're not allowed to do this anymore. So that's why a lot of these videos have now dried up. You're not allowed to see them anymore. But now these body snatchers are out in full force. 30,000 per month they're rounding up off the streets. Do you have a disability? Who cares? Walk with a limp? Doesn't matter. Are you mentally disabled? Doesn't matter. We'll throw you in the wagon and we'll take you off to the front lines. Are you old? It doesn't matter. Are you too young? It doesn't matter. Do you support your family and your family's relying on your one income and you can't go to war? Doesn't matter. We're going to throw you into a wagon and you're going to go fight. That's exactly what's happening. The body snatchers are out in full force all over the country, grabbing men off the streets just like never before, dragging them into vans, forcing them to go fight, young men, old men. It doesn't matter anymore at all. This is a nation that is absolutely desperate right now to fill its meat grinder ranks. Speaking of meat, this desperate conscription drive has led to some appalling scenes like this. According to reporting from RT, there are now meat trucks operating with Ukrainian men trying to get out of Ukraine, hiding in frozen meat trucks like this one, like in the body, in the corpses of frozen meat, trying to bury themselves within this. Here you can see these men being rounded up. And so now they're stopping these meat trucks as Ukrainian draft dodgers are trying to get out, trying to get into Moldova and trying to get into Poland and other countries right now. Military recruiters are stopping these meat trucks, and instead of finding all this frozen meat in there, they're having to dig through and find all these men that are trying to escape the draft right now. Now, why should we, here in the United States, care about the conscription practices of countries thousands of miles away? Because, my friends, what is happening in Ukraine could very well foreshadow what might be happening here at home in the United States. The most recent edition of the U.S. Army War College's academic journal includes a section that's titled Casualties, Replacements, and Reconstitutions. Now, we've covered what the Biden administration has been doing towards a draft, and I think it's worth repeating today. And I think, the Mises Institute, Libertarian Mises Institute, really, did a great article on this last year that we featured here. Just let this sink in for a moment. The thought of returning to a military draft, a system that forces our young citizens into combat roles, is being seriously considered by Pentagon brass. The context provided within this essay notes that in the event of a large-scale conflict, the U.S. military could face a staggering 3,600 casualties per day, requiring 800 replacements per day. For context, the U.S. suffered about 50,000 casualties over 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so the essay suggests that such a number could be reached in just 2 weeks of intensive combat in a large-scale war. In other words, facing Russia head-on would leave us with 50,000 casualties in just 2 weeks of fighting. Unbelievable. So they need a draft. They need a conscription. They need to be able to get as many men as possible into these roles, into these ranks. And you'll recall, of course, the Biden administration lowered military standards and opened it up to, hey, you're transgender? Come on in. We'll welcome you. You have lower fitness standards? Come on in. We'll welcome you into the U.S. military. We need them right now. The military is already grappling with a significant recruiting shortfall. Last year alone, the Army missed its recruitment goal by 15,000 soldiers, and it's projected to fall short by an additional 20,000 this year. So a draft is honestly the only way they're going to be able to stand up to Russia, put boots on the ground in Ukraine, be able to stand up to Iran. Oh, and by the way, what are your plans for China? You want to mix that into this as well? Turns out using drones, using aircraft is not the answer and is not the solution, and you are going to lose. So if you want to walk away and lose Ukraine completely, then you can do that. Otherwise, they're going to have to put boots on the ground. As Colonel Douglas Macgregor points out, Putin does not want a conflict with NATO. He said that repeatedly, but it looks like he's about to get one.
President Putin wants to avoid a direct confrontation with the United States and NATO. He's never wanted it. We're the ones that goaded him into attacking into eastern Ukraine to begin with. We're the ones that wanted to place forces right on his border with the goal of attacking him. We're the ones that wanted to place missile systems there. So I think it's very obvious that under the circumstances, he could have attacked with any number of different weapon systems a long time ago, and he hasn't done it. I hope he can continue to exercise restraint, because I think we're nearing the end of this tragedy, frankly.
So there you go. That's what's happening right now. The U.S. Involved in this, and we could see a major development here with boots on the ground, and and the U.S. military realizing, of course, that in fact they do not have the opportunity to win this war without having boots on the ground. They cannot do it with aircraft alone. They cannot do it with drones alone. So we will see what happens in Russia and in Ukraine over the next 48 hours. We'll see.
Welcome, everyone. This is your host, Danny Haiphong. Welcome back to another live stream. I hope you are all doing well. We are here joined by International Affairs and Security Analyst Mark Sleboda, friend of the show, returning guest. Mark, how are you doing today?
Danny, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show. I'm alive. How are you? And to the rest of you out there that are willing to subject yourselves to the pain of listening to me to rant on a geopolitical soapbox for the next hour and a half, well, may God/the goddess have mercy on your souls.
Well, the honor is all mine, Mark. Let's get started. How about that? Everyone, as you come in, please do hit the like button. That helps boost the stream and the algorithm. Of course, you can go to the video description and find all the places to support this show and this channel. I will link Mark's Telegram and his Twitter at the end of the show, so you can go there after the end of the show and make sure you follow his work. So let's get started. Mark, let us begin with the vaunted Kursk offensive. I wanted to ask you, is the Kursk offensive the victory that the Western media says it is? Because there's a lot of reports from Russian media that are not only talking about Ukraine and its forces being pummeled, huge losses of both manpower and equipment, but also reports of a hardened Russian military and a hardened Russian population that is increasingly ready to also make moves that perhaps the United States and NATO were hoping would never be considered, such as ending Ukraine altogether, as some Russian media outlets have published. So, Mark, how did this happen? And is this the victory that the Western media is saying it is?
Okay, so first off the bat, tactically, yes, it's a victory. In fact, I think people will probably study in the future exactly how this occurred, the tactics that were used. The Kiev regime / NATO, right? Because although the U.S. and Europe and NATO, UK were quick to put out, I know nothing, I see nothing, they just tell us about it after it happened. This is all nonsense. On the Ukrainian media outlet Resident, right where as the first day or two that the offensive was launched, they put right out their sources inside Zelensky's office, inside the regime, made clear that this was done not only with the full knowledge of NATO, but with the planning, that British intelligence was actually actively involved in planning this thing all out. And we know further, the Times reported just in the last 24 that troops for this, special forces, were brought to the UK to train exactly for this mission. So they were clearly involved at all levels in this. This was another NATO proxy offensive. However, they learned their lessons from the last failed NATO proxy offensive. There was no trailer, right? There was no forecasting months ahead of time. It seems they did a very good job of operational security. Their own troops were not informed in many cases until they were actually arriving in the Sumy region, where they were going and what they were doing, for many of them, not for all of them, obviously, but for many of them. And I suspect that the Kiev regime also was playing a very deliberate disinformation game. There were multiple buildups going on. There is another buildup to the west in the Sumy region, that not at the Suja breakthrough point, but at Chokina, which we may see that launched in the coming days. I think we very likely will. So this story actually isn't over. There were buildups in the Belgorod region. There is also a big buildup in the Zaporozhye region. In fact, one of the constant refrains that we were hearing on the Telegram channels, even as this offensive was launched, was that this is just a sideshow, is that the big offensive to come is in Zaporozhye, and we'll be targeting the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant again. Now, that may yet happen, but clearly what is happening in Kursk is not a sideshow. It appears that it has goals, multiple goals, right? There's always more than one motivation, one goal, and its most lurid goals were not met. We'll meet that, but many of them were. Tactically and for the information war, this was a victory, right? They smacked Russia around really good. There's no question about it. And I hate to say I told you so, but I know that there is a lot of well-meaning pro-Russian military analysts out there who have for months been saying, this is all going to be over in 2 months. This is all going to be over in 2 months. The Kiev regime's military is collapsing. A lot of these people have been saying the exact same thing since February of 2022. And repeat it again and again and again. Every once in a while, reality like this, they overestimate Russian forces. They think they cannot make mistakes. They can. They do. They have. And they will. The Russian, not just the troops that command, it should be more specifically said. And the political system, because sometimes the Kremlin has put moronic restraints on the military, particularly in the beginning phases of this conflict. Naive mistakes that were counting on diplomacy and negotiations and, the West seeing logic and not being willing to trash Europe's economies and the entire state and people of Ukraine in order to fulfill their hegemonic geopolitical ambitions. But quite obviously, the Kiev regime military is not dead. I suspect that even after this, right, and it must be said that while tactically and information-wise, this is a victory. Chalk it up. It is. It's a humiliation. It's an insult. It's an embarrassment. It's left Russian forces scrambling around. Strategically, it's a blunder. It possibly a huge blunder, right? And we've seen this as well from, I mean, even sources in the West. Der Spiegel had a piece out this week, right? Very pro-Kiev regime, German publication, saying that this may be the military end of the Kiev regime, right? Why? Because they don't have to spare the resources in men and equipment that they're using for this operation that has no strategic value that anyone can identify. It was a weak point, right? This was the weakest point in the Russian defensive lines. These borders were literally guarded by border patrol, by 18-year-old Russian draftees, right? Russia, like a lot of countries, like Israel, like Sweden, young men, if they're not going on to higher education, have to serve a year in the military. And a lot of people get out of it, to be perfectly honest. But increasingly, it's not necessarily seen as a bad thing. It's only a year. But they have been kept out of the SMO, right? Because they're draftees. They're not trained military troops, per se. Now, if after that year, they decide to stay on, right? You know, given a bonus to stay on and sign a contract, which many of them do, that's great. Then they go, they get further training, months, possibly a year, and then get sent into the SMO zone. There are lots of those. But there are just a few incidences in the entire history, two and a half plus years of this conflict, where a few Russian draftees somehow ended up in the combat, maybe very early on. And those generals were, well, let's say they're no longer, they're looking for new careers at this point, because that has been part of Putin's political compact with the Russian population over the special military operation, over the intervention in the Ukrainian civil conflict. That their young sons doing their year of military service will not be used. Well, that's all very well and good, but when the Kiev regime comes up and attacks Russia, we've seen little isolated incidences of this previously in Belgorod, with these Russian neo-Nazis fighting for the Kiev regime alongside Kiev regime's military intelligence and special forces. They try to pretend that these didn't happen sometimes, but they had very disastrous raids in April of this year in the Belgorod region, and also in the early spring last year, the year before. So this isn't, the first time, but those were farcical affairs, really. They were crossing the border, firing some guns around border villages, and then getting smacked hard. This was not that. So they learned their lessons from that. They learned their lessons from the disastrously failed Russian mauled 2023 summer offensive in the South. So first of all, they had much better operational security. And we'll have to have a talk about this later. But the clearest that I can see, this was a huge failure of Russian intelligence and military intelligence. They dropped the ball completely. Now, Let's talk about what those two differences are. Russian intelligence would have been signals intelligence, human intelligence, right? People placed within the Kiev regime and the military that feed information to the Russians, interception of communications, spies in the British or American bureaucracy that could have found out about it as well, because obviously these countries were so intimately involved in all of this. For one thing, that tells us is that the Kiev regime has, at this point in the conflict, finally purged a lot of Russian spies from their ranks, militarily and politically. Whereas in the beginning of the conflict, they leaked like a sieve, and then the Americans were constantly complaining about it. That's not good. Right, that's bad. No signals intelligence. They were obviously very careful with that. When we're talking military intelligence, the analysis of satellite and drone footage, right, about the Kiev regime's military buildups in the Sumy region. There is talk that some of these troops were actually originally positioned in the north, just north of Kiev, and that they were kind of like a reserve force and guarding the border with Belarus, just in case Lukashenko ever decided to enter this conflict, which I don't think he ever will. And anyway, and I don't think actually Russia wants him to, because that would be an excuse for NATO to intervene directly, which there's a lot more of NATO than there are of Belarus's relatively small military without any combat experience, or not much anyway. So military intelligence should have identified the logistics that were being set up, the troops, the materials, everything that was being sent. Unlike a military force that was built up on the plains of the steppes of Zaporozhye last year outside of Rehov, clearly visible, they managed to build up a fairly sizable military force. We're talking, by some estimates, 4 or 5 brigades, maybe 6. Numbers aren't really clear at this point. Kiev regime's brigades are, of course, often dramatically under strength. Just as a joke at some point. Sometimes they're company sized and less, and we've had testaments to that in the Western media. So just because you see a brigade is participating doesn't mean it's a full strength brigade. There may only be small stripped off parts. This was a Frankenstein force assembled from lots of different military units, but they also had some of the best remaining, including in the Kiev regime's military reserves, including the 22nd Mechanized Brigade and the 80 and 82nd Air Assault Brigades, paratroopers. That they either failed to detect this buildup, right, hiding their military vehicles in the urban environment of Sumy, that they used to shelter these forces until just before they go, or they misinterpreted them, that they viewed them as a defensive buildup rather than an offensive buildup. Whatever the reason, they dropped the ball, intelligence and military intelligence alike. Now, I know there are some people who a lot of Russian analysts, or not a lot, but some, I should say, some. I'm pretty sure it's a minority, but and some Western analysts taking cues from that Russia knew about this beforehand and they let it happen. Now, some of the arguments against this, because of the long-term strategic damage it will do to the Kiev regime, their forces, these forces would have been much better spent incurring a higher loss ratio, casualty ratio on Russian forces if they were in hardened defensive fortifications defending the Kiev regime's own territory. Pokrovsk or Toretsk or, in the future, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, anywhere, right? They would have incurred a much higher loss. They would have been harder to unroot. So some people have been suggesting that Russia knew about this beforehand and allowed it to happen to draw them out, to draw them into this, and that this is some type of, Russian 5D chess move. It's not entirely impossible, right? Some of the arguments against it is that would mean that Putin put Russian civilians at risk, and there have been at just as of a couple days ago, there were some 12 dead, a couple hundred injured, right? And not only that, but the political damage, the humiliation in the Russian media, the political damage there, the problem with a couple dozen of these young draftees, 18-year-old draftees being taken POW, which the Kiev regime is making a huge propaganda thing about. The damage, the reputation to the rest of the world, Russia's winning, that they finally come around to. And then, the NAFO trolls are back in rare form, as I'm sure pretty much all of you have seen over the last week. It's something you just gotta grin and bear with it, I guess, or just block them, which is like what I do. It's a lot of problems with that, though, with that narrative. It's not impossible. I'm not 100% ruling it out. For those of you who don't think Putin is cold-blooded enough to do that, I got something to tell you. Putin is absolutely cold-blooded enough to make that calculus if that would end the war quicker. Right. And because you can do an easy calculus and say the amount of civilians that die in this will be far less than the amount of Russian civilians that if the war drags on for another 2 or 3 or more years. Right. So Putin is absolutely capable of making that calculus. He's FSB, old school KGB. He is a cold, rational, logical beast. Right. Not to saying, and here's part of the problem with this whole thing is it's a belief. You end up believing that Russia can't make mistakes, that they're omniscient and omnipotent, and they foresee everything. And quite obviously, looking at the last 2.5 years, that is not the case. We really would have won after 2 months if that was the case. They would have mobilized immediately, blah, blah, blah. So while I'm not 100% ruling it out, Occam's razor, Russia dropped the ball. There was a misinterpretation of military intelligence. They fell for disinformation, directing their attention somewhere else, something of that sort. And there's a couple of really panicked responses to that I think would further lend credence to that. Quite obviously, Russia did not have tactical reserves in the Sumy region that were prepared to deal with this, right? For the first 2 days, the defense was largely done by the ad hoc forces, these border patrol, these draftees, policemen, and auxiliary units in the Russian forces. There are plenty of stories of towns being defended by cooks and drivers and mechanics and doing a bang-up job for all of that, really slowing down the Kiev regime forces in a number of locations. But for 2.5 days, that was the primary defense force. They were falling back in, a couple places they surrendered. But more often than not, they fought hard, and then they withdrew in good order, and they did it again. So they deserve credit for that. Second of all, is that particularly when it comes to the defense of the the Kursk nuclear power plant, and the erecting now, late in the game, of more serious fortifications than were on the border area in the north, just ahead of the Kiev regime's incursion point in the direction of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Russia is literally putting out advertisements, all right, in media and social media in Russia, hiring people for $4,000 a month, which is pretty good money. It's as much as many troops make, to dig trenches for fortifications. Right now, of course, they've got machines and everything else, but they're putting up very serious defenses now. Late in the game, they didn't have them on the border. There wasn't this big, huge Surovikin line defensive position to defend against this on the border area. But they're erecting it now. All of this speaks a very ad hoc response. I see no organized indication of or having the assets in place to respond. Again, when you're not responding, not just in the first day, but the second day, and it's only in the third day that you've got enough reserves in theater to even begin some counterattacks and to buff up the Kursk nuclear power plant. I'm sorry. I would need a lot more evidence. There's too many fuck ups here. To be perfectly honest, I believe that the ball was dropped. We'll see in the course of time, but that's my call as I see it now.
Mark, could you talk about, earlier you mentioned that, because I think this is all great context for people to know, especially your analysis on whether this was a trap or not. I wanted to ask, though, about the strategic blunder you mentioned earlier for Ukraine, because what we hear, and perhaps it is a kernel, there is the kernel of truth in the Western media, is exactly this, is that it was a humiliation. But now I also see the rolling in of, well, exactly as you have intimated, that this was a strategic blunder, perhaps, talking about risks. And as you said, Der Spiegel, the military end of Ukraine. So I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah. So the question there is, what is the motivation? What were the goals of the Kiev regimes with this attack, right? With this surprise offensive that no one was really expecting something this of this scale, not in this direction, not now. I don't think anyone was. I certainly wasn't. In fact, I was expecting a possible Russian offensive out of the Sumy area. But so the first thing that has to be talked about, I think, above all, is the Kursk nuclear power plant. If you take a look at this area, this is a backwoods border, right? This border has rarely seen any, a few DRGs going back and forth on either side over the course of 2.5 years. It was a sleepy backwater. That is why Russia didn't have any serious fortifications or troops or tactical reserves in the area, because the area has no strategic value. It is heavily forested. It has the population here is small, spread out, podunk villages and hamlets on both sides of the border, right? There are no strategic goals. There is no way that anything of the size, Kursk, if you want to say, oh, the goal to take the city of Kursk, that's nonsense. That's like the idea that the Russian offensive in Kharkov was ever intended to take Kharkov city. To take large urban centers like that, you need hundreds of thousands of people, right? So let's write that off there. But the one possible thing, if you're a crazy Banderite military intelligence chief like Kyrylo, I like the Dark Budanov, who seems to absolutely get physically and stimulated and excited about the possibility of nuclear catastrophes. And Zelensky seems fully on board with that. Is the real definitive goal of this operation seemed to have been to storm quickly up through these defenses, take the first few towns like Suja and Karenova, and seize the Kursk nuclear power plant. And there is a possibility, a strong possibility, that there are facilities in the area of Kurchatov, which is the Russian town just outside the Kursk nuclear power plant. And the town is named after the father of the Russian, the primary father of the Russian nuclear program to begin with. There's a possibility that there were nuclear weapon storage there as well, a warhead storage, particularly for warheads that can be placed on Iskander missiles and the like, and what else. Whether they're still there, whether Russia ever withdrew them for safety once the conflict began, we don't know this. But whether the goal was simply to attack the plant, to seize the plant and trade it for the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, to seize nuclear weapons in the area that they know or believed were there, that had to have been the goal, because there's nothing else that you can identify. If you want to call, I don't know if I would call that strategic. That's more, a nuclear terrorist insanity. But if you want to call it strategic, fine. Then that was the only possible strategic goal. Now, that power plant is 55 kilometers back from the border. And at their best penetration point, even with DRGs, mobile groups, not definitive, not troops taking territory, I never saw that they got closer than like 20 kilometers to that plant. So they were still a good way off. But they even had a deep fake video produced of the Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova in the first week. They had her saying that Russia would be willing to trade the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in return for the Kiev regime pulling its troops out of the Kursk region, which is obviously false, right? But I think the fact that they would go through the trouble to make this deep fake is probably a good indication of what they wanted, right? They wanted this as leverage. They wanted to trade this for Zaporozhye, something along those lines, and the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, or they wanted to cause a nuclear catastrophe on Russian territory. Take your pick. So that seems to have been the ultimate goal. Now, if that was the goal, then it failed, because they would have had to take Suja on the first day. They would have had to take, by some reports, the Kursk nuclear power plant by August 11th. They're obviously not going to be able to do that now. It seems very unlikely. Russia obviously has enough reserves, and they're building fortifications and defenses now. I'm sure they've taken lots of measures. When Russia first sent reserves in, that's where they went, right? They went to shield up the fortifications, the defenses, to secure the plant, the related nuclear facilities around, possibly weapon storage facilities, and to secure the routes towards there. That's why even in the first few, like day 3, day 4, day 5, when Russian reserves were still entering the theater, they were only there in the north, right? There wasn't much fight back anywhere else, because that was the priority, is to defend that location as So now, other than that, and there's always more than one reason for launching for making military political decisions, right? You always make lists of pros and cons, right? So there's always multiple reasons. And obviously, one of the pros was that this was a weak point, right? They can't beat Russia. They're just getting ground down in Pokrovsk. They can't stop the Russian steamroller, the breakthrough in that direction. They're completely unable to stop the breakthrough in the Toretsk, New York agglomeration. Kupiansk area is now a complete mess for them. Their Zaporozhye offensive last year was ground into dust. So rather, if they need a victory, right? Well, then you go for the weakest point, right? And that's what they did. Now, Russia's like, well, of course it's the weakest point. It has no strategic value, but a strategic value other than the power plant idea may not have been the top of their list, right? They talk about these humiliating Russia. They talk about the morale of the Kiev regime troops. And perhaps even more important than the morale of the Kiev regime troops is the morale of their Western patrons that provide them the money and the arms. I often get the idea that the Kiev regime isn't guided by military and strategy and logic in a lot of this conflict, but it's more performance art put on for the Western patrons that keep this conflict running. So that is the other. There's several other things that are put out there that are obviously nonsense. The idea, first, that this was a diversionary attack. Well, we're already going into the second week, so it doesn't seem. It's obviously not just a diversionary attack. I myself suggested it might be that in the first or second day, but it quite obviously it's much bigger than that. The other is this idea that's being put forward in the Western media that the rationale for this is to get Russia to pull troops out of those breakthroughs in the Donbass and relocate them here, and which Russia has not done at all, right? I mean, there's a few select units. I know of one elite drone unit that was transferred from Chasiv Yar, simply because at this point there's a lot more high value equipment targets for them in the Kursk region than there is in now urban fighting in Chasiv Yar. So a few very select movements, but the Western mainstream media has admitted this, right? It's been admitted in the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post that there is no evidence of Russia moving any significant forces or slowing down in any way their offensives, their bloody offensives of great strategic import in the Pokrovsk area, in Toretsk, New York. In fact, Kiev regime troops talking to reporters in commentary for the New York Times, among others, they said the exact opposite, that pressure has increased on them since the Kursk offensive, that Russians are pushing harder. And those same Western media prostitutes who are writing articles presenting the Kiev regime argument about Russian moving troops will admit later in the same article, right? Again, they admit it, that the Kiev regime pulled troops out of these collapsing fronts for this Kursk adventure. So it's not only that Russia didn't divert forces for this, they did. They devoted defensive forces from Chasiv Yar, from Pokrovsk, from Toretsk, from all of these three places and others, because the Western mainstream media interviewed people, Ukrainian troops, that go there. So we know that is not in question. But they fail to then make the logical leap that, well, not only did Russia not withdraw troops, but the Kiev regime did. They left themselves completely exposed in this. Why? Because they're doing wartime propaganda. They're not doing journalism. So they can't make that logical in print, which, more than likely they're certainly capable of doing in their own heads. But the same articles that will mention that there's no indication of Russian troop movements and will somewhere in the train mention that the Kiev regime did pull troops out, they won't draw the logical conclusion about the strategic blunder there of having done this. So that argument is just complete bunk. Better the nuclear power plant, better some idea of morale for their own Banderite forces. Although a lot of those people still fighting in Pokrovsk and Toretsk and other places, they're not getting a war morale fuzzy from this. I hate to tell you, they're complaining very bitterly about being left to die with not enough troops, anywhere near enough troops to stage a defense, and that's very telling. So that is ultimately the big strategic thing. Now, one of the problems with this is simply logistics. The Kiev regime has to keep these forces, these several thousand troops that they've managed to move into these podunk hamlets and villages in the Kursk region. They have to supply them. They have to supply these mostly mobile units, right? The idea of fast and mobile, with fuel. They have to supply them with ammunition and food and water when they're not raiding local stores and that sort of thing, which is, will only last so long. And that will be very hard for them because they're in a salient surrounded then on three sides by Russia that is just pounding them with artillery, with drones, with air power, with the glide bombs, FABs and CABs and everything else. And these roads that they're using, because obviously they can't use railroads to supply their forces there. These roads are already roads of death. And that's where Russia is actually racking up a lot of its kills, is not necessarily in large-scale counterattacks, but just bleeding them as they attempt to provide supplies, reinforcements, evacuation of damaged vehicles, all of that. It's unsustainable in the long term. So that is the strategic blunder. Now, I do want to talk a bit about the tactical success that the Kiev regime here. First was, of course, surprise, and I as far as I see it, they achieved a high degree of surprise. The whole crux of this was that this was a weak point, that they wouldn't meet much initial resistance. And rather than try to do the NATO of massing big mechanized armor groupings and everything like they did for the Zaporozhye offensive in 2023, they used mostly small mobile DRGs and mobile mechanized forces, that the entire focus was on dispersion, spread out, right? So there's not one big, hundreds of little units moving up roads. So there wasn't something for Russia to focus their long-range fires on, and speed and mobility, speed above all. All right. So when they crossed the border, they actually, and they did it in several waves with different types of troops, they actually avoided some of the initial Russian fortifications. They just went around them. They zoom, right? And carried on. And then it was only the second or the third wave that would actually focus on taking out these fortifications. And by then, they were already cut off by fast-moving units that had already moved past them and are setting up ambushes on roads and the like. So they couldn't get reinforcements. They couldn't get supply. They ran out of ammunition. And in many cases, they then had no choice but to surrender. In some cases, they didn't, and they fought to the end. These were small groups of, again, border patrol, draftees, auxiliary police, and they actually deserve credit for holding up as long as they did. The Kiev regime had very advanced tactics. They had a very strong electronic warfare presence that I have not seen them exhibit previously. They shut down Russian reconnaissance drones on that first day, well into the second day. And certainly strike drones and FPV drone, everything else. There was an electronic warfare battle going on. Now, I think by the second day, Russia was able to shut down Starlink in the area. So that inhibited their communications. But a part of the initial breakthrough and their ability to move quickly and uncontested was because Russia's reconnaissance drones and FPV drones were hindered by the Kiev regime's electronic warfare. And it was only after they moved out of the range of that shield that they became more vulnerable. They also used extensive remote mine laying. And it has to be said that part of the reasons why they were able to storm this is, if you'll go back, you'll look that Russia actually removed many of their own defensive mine layers in this direction, because there was the possibility that they were going to launch an offensive in the Sumy area. So they actually removed a lot, not all, but a lot of their own minefields. So that made it much easier for the Kiev regime. They had less mines to avoid, and they did use some demining equipment, and they used it quickly and successfully this time when they did have to remove mines. Second of all, they did remote mine laying. They used remote mine laying ahead to mine the roads that Russian forces ahead of them would need to send in reinforcements and supplies, and that civilians would be trying to evacuate on. So that got really messy. They also used remote mine laying to protect their flanks in the initial phases of this, and they're still doing that now. They used some very advanced psyops, right? They did a lot of deep fake videos, including of Maria Zakharova, including of the Kursk region governor demanding that everyone evacuate. They also did psyops sending out messages, commuting to people, often directly through Telegram, through mobile phone networks, sending them messages, claiming to be the Kursk authorities, and basically ordering everyone in the Kursk region, even if they were nowhere near the fighting, to evacuate immediately. And that, of course, choked up the roads with civilians trying to escape, making it harder for Russia to get the reinforcements and supplies and evacuate the wounded that they needed from the contact points. Also, they played a very good cyber warfare game. They seized control of the camera on the roads, right? Traffic cameras. They also seized control, reportedly, of a lot of private houses' cameras. So the first 3, even 4 days of this, they were watching Russian troops approach. And Russia, again, to my argument that Russia did not know about this beforehand, that it was not a trap purposefully laid, is in one particular instance where I think this was on day 3 or 4, when Russia was trying to reassure the Russian public that everything is under control, which it wasn't, that Russian reinforcements are, traveling to the region. And one of the things they've done now, and they did in previous episodes, is to show these big convoys of troops moving in that direction, right? In this case, there actually was some troops being moved in large convoys in the direction. And the Kiev regime was watching the Russian television channels, and they geolocated where that convoy was, and they were very quickly, them or the Americans, take your pick, and they were hitting that convoy with HIMARS, doing lots of damage, lots of vehicles, and most likely a very high casualty count as well. So everything was based on speed, mobility, dispersion. A lot of this, there wasn't a solid contact line. It was dueling DRG groups ambushing themselves on forest roads in between these podunk settlements. So, I mean, they succeeded in breaking Russia's weakest border. They succeeded in seizing somewhere between 30 and 74 settlements, right? But if you're counting 74, I think you're counting some individual 30 some individual farms as settlements. That's clearly an exaggeration, and you'll hear the Kiev regime's own numbers about how much Russian territory they control. They don't actually all control a lot of this territory. They have a very small force relatively for the size of this territory, and it has to be spread out because there's simply not a lot of high-rise buildings to keep troops safe in as barracks and the like. These are little podunk towns of houses and dachas and whatnot. This has, the initial days, there wasn't a contact line. There wasn't a clear zone of control. Now we're starting to move into that phase. But for more than a week, it was dueling DRG groups and the like in a lot of cases on the ground. Now, Russia tried to make up for their lack of defensive tactical reserves that could immediately respond with long-range strikes, with Lancets, which they racked up a lot of kills. Fabs, once they were able to get more responsive drone reconnaissance with artillery, tornado strikes, multiple launch rocket systems, and the like. But we're getting close to the 2-week point now. And it is only now, in the last couple of days, that Russia has stabilized the front line, more or less, in the north, in the direction of the northwest, in the direction of the Kursk nuclear power plant, and in the east. And I haven't seen the Kiev regime be able to make any further advances there. And Russia has actually counterattacked and made a few, taken a few small settlements back, right? The largest settlement that we're talking here is Suja, which as of 3 or 4 days ago, the Kiev regime more or less effectively got complete control of. The last Russian forces were able, but that's a town of just some 5,000 people, right? I mean, obviously not now, but so there's just not a lot of place to hide troops, right? So that is and to store ammunition and fuel and the like, arms depots. So all of that makes it very vulnerable. But they, as of this morning, as of 12 hours ago, they're still now expanding to the west. They're still, as Russia's taking some settlements back from the north and the east, they're still expanding some to the west, in the direction of Chokin. And here's the problem is that the Glushovsky district, where the Kiev regime made their breakthrough in Suja, there is an area to the west of that, and there is another buildup of Kiev regime forces on their border, where the border turns a bit in that direction there of Chokin. Gluboka, I think, something like that. Now, it seems obvious to me that they're falling back on, they're doubling down. They're obviously not pulling these troops out after failing to seize the nuclear power plant, right? They're going to go for the keep Russian territory as long as they can, for the info war, for the TikTok war, for, they imagine there's going to be leverage in negotiations. Well, the Russian government has made clear no negotiations now, none, right? We're done. No good negotiations. Finally, they're saying that. It's about fucking time. But they're probably going to send this next force into this Glushovsky district, this next buildup. So there's going to be another incursion. And then they're going to effectively encircle the Glushovsky district of the Kursk region. Again, sparsely populated, nothing really there, but they'll be able to claim another 20 or 30 settlements, and they'll be able to claim, another few hundred square kilometers of territory that they've taken from Russia. It's it's going to be a second wave of incursion. So they're looking where is still weak, where they can expand. If they're blocked from moving north to the power plant or from moving east, then they found the open hole to spread out into the west. And it appears that's what they're going to do. And as of this afternoon, they are actively destroying all of the bridges. That is, well, on one hand, it's preventing Russia from moving more troops into the area, but I think far more importantly, it's preventing Russian civilians from escaping, right? From evacuating from this area. And it's starting to look very close like they intend to use Russian civilians as hostages. That is what it appears to me that they're trying to do. So ultimately, I mean, Russia has stopped them from achieving their obvious intention to me to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant. They weren't able to prevent any further. Russia has blocked them up in the north and the east, but the game isn't over. They're not going to recognize their strategic failure, their inability to seize their ultimate tactical goal of the Kursk nuclear power plant. They're not backing down from this. They're doubling down. We've also seen several border attacks to the east in the Belgorod region as well in the last week. They keep making them repeatedly. All of these, to my knowledge, have been stopped more or less at the border. None of them have been a successful incursion yet. These are all much smaller. But you see, they're spreading out on east and west from this incursion point, looking for more weak places to punch through. They're not giving up on this, even as Russia continues to rape the Pokrovsk area and raises the Russian flag in New York and is fighting now door to door in central Toretsk. Russian forces are now 10 kilometers away from Pokrovsk. And they're moving faster than I can keep up. I don't even learn the names of the villages and towns in that direction because Russia's already taken them, the first time you've heard of them. And then they're faded from view already. And it has to be said that there was another attempted assault in the first week, last week, where the Kiev regime also attempted to once again to seize at the mouth of the Dnieper River, this Kinburn spit. And there's another spit there as well. They tried both times to land Marines there. There's no people there. There's nothing there. But the idea they have in their head, or the British admiral who's directing this Black Sea game, they imagine if they can take control of this spit at the mouth of the Dnieper, they can then somehow leapfrog to launching more attacks on Crimea. That's the idea. But that ended in complete failure. Was it intended as diversionary or whether it was just stopped? They're not done. They're fighting everywhere. And they're resorting to dirty tricks, new tactics, new innovations on the battlefield. They're getting Russian. In some cases, Russia is stopping them flat. In other cases, they're achieving some tactical success. And everyone is ignoring what's going on in central Donbass. Now, to put this into perspective, I'm talking a lot about this Kursk thing, but from our side, now that they can't reach the Kursk nuclear power plant, it's a sideshow, right? And the Russian government can take their time. They're sending our reserves from out of theater, from wherever, to deal with the best. We're sending our worst to deal with their best in this Kursk incursion. And there's not going to be any rush, right? The Russian government's like, the PR damage has been done. We will be methodical. We will deal with this, but they could be there for weeks or months into the future, depending on how many good resources, manpower and equipment wise, they want to throw after bad. But they won't gain anything for it strategically. The only war they're winning is the TikTok war, and that's not gonna win anything. But ultimately, this will be acknowledged as the strategic blunder it was. But Russia, you should not be completely sanguine with that, right? You have to recognize the tactical success, and you have to learn the lessons that they had from that. Because they definitely have demonstrated they're pulling lots of tricks, psychological, psyops, cyber warfare assets, these mobile tactics and using forests that has always worked good for them this entire conflict. They're not trying to fight a NATO large scale armor heavy maneuver warfare. It's a different type. It's a maneuver warfare, but it's a more along the lines of what worked for them in Kharkov, which again, our forces were actively already withdrawing. So I'm not so sure that was a military success either. Now, while I'm saying it's a tactical victory for them, right? Keep in mind that that's them sending their best units against our worst in a part of the front that we thought wasn't significant enough for them to do anything at. So keep that with a grain of salt. But obviously there is going to be political repercussions from this. The West is happy, right? Maybe they didn't achieve the goal of the Kursk nuclear power plant, but new promises of escalation have come forward. Germany just announced a new military package through the end of the year for the Kiev regime, which includes 30 more Leopard tanks. I think I haven't seen specifically, but I imagine they'll be refurbished 1950s Leopard 1s, but that still. But 1,400 APCs, 1,400 armored personnel carriers. Again, obviously not the best things they were pulling out of storage and getting rid of, but also some Gepard air defense, some more Iris-T. The U.S. is now actively talking about providing JASSMs, air-launched cruise missiles that supposedly the F-16s will be used for. These are much longer range than the ATACMS. They carry a substantial 450 kilogram warhead. The Pentagon is launched contracts to expand production of these into the future. I imagine they'll immediately send them some out of the Pentagon stocks. And then this is what I'm pointing out is that on one hand, the Western military seems that Russia at least got bloodied and embarrassed out of this. And they're using that to escalate more, to continue to send more military equipment, to escalate more, rather than seeing it as a strategic blunder, which of course ultimately it will be, right? Even the New York Times had admittedly an opinion piece out in the last 24 that victory is a headline, that victory is within Putin's grasp. And this was a much, I don't agree with everything there, but a much better than most of the tripe you've been seeing. But the West is not backing down. There are not going to be any peace negotiations There are not this year. Russia has ruled that out, and quite obviously the Kiev regime isn't interested. They were faking interest in peace negotiations before launching this offensive. Russian side doesn't want them. And the West is obviously going to continue arming this regime. They're already talking now about expanding the conscription once again to younger than 25, to their vulnerable, very small 18 to 25-year-old male graphic. Women are being sent to the contact line. They're volunteers at this point, but they're not giving up. They're not crumbling. They're not breaking. They are failing in the Pokrovsk direction, but they are fighting hard and dirty and in some cases committedly elsewhere. I see no immediate near future signs of Kiev regime military collapse that a lot of people have been, hopium for some time now. So some people have been hopium on it for years. And I think it's important for us, even as we see the strategic failure here, right? Short-term pain for Russia, medium to long-term strategic gain. The Kiev regime walked themselves into a trap in many ways, even if we didn't open a trap for them. But that doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory. It's not. And I think this should be a wake-up call, a slap in the face to people who were getting a little too triumphalist, right? Over the last, 8-9 months, going on a year of Russian victory after grinding victory. This game is not done yet, and it's not anywhere near done, more than likely. I hope I'm wrong on that. I could be wrong, but I see no indications that the Kiev regime is collapsing, that they're willing to back down. I see no indication that the West is backing down. Everything points to more escalation, more desperation and dirty tricks moving forward. Expect the unexpected. Be prepared that there could be another offensive launched in the Zaporozhye region in the very near future, because there's a big buildup of troops happening down there. And does it make any sense? Does it make more military strategic sense to pile all of those troops into defensive fortifications and to defend and withdraw and defend and withdraw? They've already made the calculation that they can't beat Russia in a war of attrition. They can't do it. They've come to that conclusion. The West has come to that conclusion. So they are trying not to fight a war of attrition. They're trying to look outside the box, right? Something to break the status quo, which is entirely in Russian favor. Now, I don't think they can innovate or pull dirty tricks enough. But when you're dealing with mad sociopathic fucks like Budanov and the guys in the Pentagon, just be prepared. I caught a flash message. I haven't seen it confirmed yet, but I saw a message that there was a launch of 12 ATACMS missiles and 5 surface kamikaze drones on the Crimean Bridge today. And they were all stopped. They were all shot down, but they're not giving up on that game either. If that report is true. So hunker down. I mean, all the long term is all in our direction. In Pokrovsk area, which is really the most important thing on the battlefield. Take a look at the Russian Ministry of Defense casualty reports, right? I actually believe they've been really accurate, more or less, for the entire conflict. But even if you don't want to believe that because you're a Banderite troll or whatever, you can still use them as an indication of how intense the fighting is in an area. the casualty counts that I saw in recently for the whole Kursk area was like 240 some, and them reporting the Kiev regime casualties, while in the Pokrovsk area it was like 2,000. That's like 10 times more fighting going on, right? So keep everything that is happening in Kursk. I mean, it's okay to be depressed. It depresses the fuck out of me. It's okay to feel humiliated. It's okay to feel dirty having to go online and seeing the posts by Western journalists and NAFO trolls and the very little distinction there between. But keep the long-term perspective and be well aware of what they're not reporting, right? In the really important battles that are going on right now in Pokrovsk and Toretsk and Kupiansk and other areas. Yeah, so I'm not quite sure if that's blackpilling or not. I prefer to think of it as just a dose of realism. You know, Russia's still, nothing has changed on the military industrial front. Nothing has changed on the manpower front. And the really important battles were just cruising through Pokrovsk and chewing up Toretsk. But you know, they're talking about Kursk, so we've got to talk about it. And I think to deal with it, you know, on a realist basis. There was a lot of Russian propaganda put out. Everything's under control. Everything's fine. Reinforcements are on the way. You know, they haven't crossed the first day. They were insisting that the border hadn't been crossed. And I'm like, what are you talking about? There's fighting in Suja. Of course the border has been crossed. So don't think that Russia doesn't put out some propaganda and disinformation to make things look a little rosier. Ultimately, it was nowhere near as rosy for the Kiev regime as their interculators put out. And it was nowhere near as rosy as, particularly in the beginning, the first few days, the Russian position was putting out. It's the truth lies, as is usual, somewhere in the middle.
Right. So, Mark, last question on this before we get to the Middle East. I wanted to ask you about the implications of this Kursk offensive, maybe beyond the battlefield, because this is, in all intents and purposes, a NATO invasion of Russian territory, and it seems to build up on a lot of escalations on the Ukraine NATO side, building more and more. It seems like there was almost a foreshadowing of this kind of assault, or at least an attack on Russian territory, further attacks, maybe deeper attacks, given that, you know, the whole collective West.
Yeah, now they're talking JASSMs, long-range cruise missiles.
Exactly. Giving long-range missiles. Before that, shorter range, you know, just over and over and over again talking about hitting Russian territory. Now there's been an invasion of Russian territory. So what are going to be the implications of this? Because it seems like with each month and that this goes on, there's a deeper and deeper.
I hate to say this, but all the time we're getting closer and closer to that inevitable NATO throws off the mask and the Kiev regime isn't capable of even serving as an effective proxy anymore. And this will end in NATO-Russia conflict. I mean, if you pay attention to some comments coming out of German generals and British and the like, they're saying things repeatedly like, we have to be prepared for war with Russia in 5 years. Why are they saying that? Is 5 years how long they expect to be able to grind out Kiev as a proxy? I give them 2 or 3 more years myself at best. But that's an indication. They're not talking, you know, they may say it publicly. Oh, Putin will then invade Poland. No, you'll send forces directly into Kiev, to Ukraine. That's what you're talking about. They can't admit that, of course. But everything still points to no surrender, no Treaty of Westphalia, no Tehran Conference division of Ukraine down armistice lines. No, No, everything points towards this does not end in some nice signed surrender or diplomacy. This ends only eventually in an ugly victory from Russia. And more than likely, that will have to come on the backs of, at some point down the line, not immediately, but some point down the line, of some type of direct, more direct conflict with NATO. And you'll notice that politically speaking, the Kiev regime went on an attempted peace negotiation offensive, right? They were talking up negotiations later in the year, but again, still only talking from terms of their Zelensky peace formula trademark, i.e., the losing side in this conflict, the side demands that the winning side unconditionally surrender to them, withdraw from all Ukrainian Kiev regime claimed territory, turning the people of Crimea and Donbass and South Ukraine over to the tender mercies of Azov and Centuria and Kraken and Right Sector and the other 31 flavors of neo-Nazi and Banderite fascist fighting for the Kiev regime. Russian leaders and political military leaders face war crimes trials and reparations. And Zelensky wants a pretty little pink pony with a ribbon too, right? Which is about as realistic as the rest of it. They're still pushing that, but they sent their foreign minister Kuleba to China. Modi is supposed to show up next week in Kiev. I don't even know if that's still on, but obviously there has been some outreach to Russia's principal allies, right? That have maintained a certain level of neutrality in this conflict, certainly more so for India or China, but continuing to defy the US by trading with Russia, also trading with Ukraine, it has to be said. China, where do you think the Kiev regime gets all its drone parts from? They get them from China, right? And if anyone is armed by China in this conflict, it's more the Kiev regime than Russia. I hate to tell you. But all of these Russian that were pushing their own peace plans, India, China, that's going to be a diplomatic smack in their faces, right? What the Kiev regime did with this offensive, because they're really, they understand that means negotiations are off. And that's certainly what the Russian side is saying. And I certainly hope they stand by. I've seen articles out in the Russian press that Ukraine should not exist, right? That's it. That's it. We're not stopping at Kiev. We're stopping at the Polish border. If then, a lot of Russians want payback against the West because it's more and more obvious that is who the real fight is against. And one more little detail that has, of course, been completely ignored on the Western media, but has become a firestorm on the Russian. Remember that Kursk, of course, is where possibly the largest battle of World War II, the Kursk region, but certainly the largest tank battle in human history was fought. And it was a titanic, battle that dwarfs anything happening in this conflict. So Kursk is very hot in the memory of Russians. So millions, laid their lives down on that battlefield. There was an incident which the Kiev regime Nazis involved, their military forces involved in this. They filmed this. There was a Kiev regime soldier. He was wearing a German style, World War II style helmet, right? Very distinctive shape, with blue and yellow SS insignia on it, literally. And he was filming a destroyed Russian convoy in the Kursk area. And a old Russian man, a pensioner, some, probably shell-shocked or whatever, came stumbling up down the road. And he started harassing this guy, calling him Ruski Ivan. How is life? Are you enjoying life now, Ruski Ivan? And then he went on to call him a Russian swine in German. Now, we don't know. The Russian side is still trying to find out. The Russian media is very interested in what eventually happened to this pensioner. Did they just harass him? Did they kill him and leave him in a ditch somewhere? But whatever. But this was filmed by Ukrainian neo-Nazis, right? They filmed it and uploaded it to social media themselves. And that is... If I saw one of the goals put forward again by these Kiev regime's interlocutors, these Mikhail Podolyak, this Kiev regime presidential advisor and Gorbulevsk mouthpiece, is to make the Russian people afraid, because fear is the only thing that gets through to them. Nothing about this made us fear. It just makes us angry, makes us furious, makes us want blood. It makes us want payback. And seeing videos like that, I can't even tell you, because the memory of World War II and the sacrifice of the Russian and other Soviet people in that conflict is obviously much closer to the Russian society's mind and collective than it is in the West. And rightly so, for the scale. Things like that, just, it will make it very, very hard down the road if Putin ever does decide to negotiate with these people, because the Russian people don't want peace. They don't want negotiations. They want this finished. They want Banderism gone. And if that means Ukrainian national identity has to go with it, then that's something they're willing to now contemplate.
Yes, indeed. Well, Mark, let us get to another side of the geopolitical spectrum that is refusing or does not want to negotiate for very different reasons, and that is what's happening in West Asia with regard to Israel's ongoing genocide. I wanted to kind of shift focus, though, on this question to the reports about Russia and Iran and its strengthening relationship, a burgeoning strategic partnership, which has had the Western media going kind of out of their minds about weapons transfers on both sides. And I wanted to ask you about, not only this, but you also have a special envoy to Israel's foreign ministry talking about how an all-out war with Iran is inevitable with Israel, and that the U.S. should strike now. The U.S. should strike now. So talk about the impact of the Russia-Iran relationship as it pertains to these developments that are going on in West Asia, Gaza, and the broader regional war that is brewing or happening and about to get worse.
So for several years now, Russia and Iran have had a strategic partnership. It must be said that Iran and China have a strategic partnership, and Russia and China have a strategic partnership. You see where this goes, right? And yearly, they also do joint naval drills, the three of them together off the coast of Iran. Now, supposedly, Russia and Iran are still on track to sign a new, improved strategic partnership in October, right? That's the last word we have. What the details of this new, deeper, stronger strategic partnership will be, I don't know. It's unlikely, but it's not inconceivable that they could include a mutual defense clause like the Russians just signed with North Korea, effectively making them actually military allies, akin to NATO. That's not impossible. I'm not so sure Russia's willing to go that way yet, but maybe, right? Maybe they're that angry. That's possible. But quite obviously, there's a huge amount of Russian-Iranian military cooperation, intelligence sharing, and military transfer going on right now. Russians and Iranians fought side by side in Syria, remember, against Western forces, against jihadis, of all stripes there, and gained a lot of respect for each other. Qasem Soleimani gained a lot of respect in Russian military circles from what I've heard. So we have seen the Iran transfer to Russia, initially some Shahed drones, and then the rights to produce their own variants of them, so the rights there. Now, I know there's continuing talk about other types of drones and ballistic missiles from Iran that may have happened, may not, who knows at this point. I haven't seen any firm evidence. But in the past week, there's been lots of talk, week plus, of Russian transfer of military equipment to Iran. Now, immediately after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas political leader and chief negotiation diplomat in Tehran, he was killed on the evening, on the attending of the new Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian. Sorry, my brain is dying here after an hour already. He was attending the inauguration and he was assassinated there. And there's a lot of misinformation, but obviously Israel was responsible. And immediately after that, and it was declared and assumed that there would be an Iranian military response, there were reports, credible reports, that there was basically a non-stop flights of Russian Il-76 military transports over the Caspian back and forth to Iran, transferring military something. And this wasn't reported. Russia and Iran, their governments, their media didn't officially acknowledge any of this, but it was initially reported in the Israeli media and the Kiev regime's media or propaganda. And then later, some in the Western media, that Russia was transferring to Iran. First, Russia is one of their most powerful electronic warfare complexes, the Murmansk BN, long range, very powerful, capable of lots of different operations. Then there was also some mention of Iskander ballistic missiles. That one seems unlikely to me, but the Israeli media was reporting it. And now, in the last week, the New York Times has reported that Russia has also been transferring S-400 air defense systems to Iran. Is that true? Does Russia have S-400 air defense systems to spare at this point? I don't know. I don't know how many they have in inventory. I don't know anyone else who does know either. But it's interesting that the New York Times was reporting this. So is Iran yet going to launch a major military retaliation that would include the entire axis of resistance, Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen? Very probably, I would say, yet. They may be taking this extended time to hook up and network Russian air defense, if Russia has provided it to them in electronic warfare, expecting an Israeli either counter retaliatory strike or even a preemptive strike when they sense that Iran is about to go. They've been talking about that. The Americans have been talking about that. So obviously Russia is providing something. At the minimum, Russia is providing satellite and other intelligence to Iran, right? At a minimum. And probably some level of military equipment. But Russia and Iran are now, I think strategic partners doesn't go far enough at this point. They understand they're in a war with the U.S., with U.S.-led Western global hegemony together, that they fall, they rise or fall. The multipolar world is born or dies, by them and China also, and possibly a few others. And they're taking a look at what each has, what assets, what particular arrows each of them has in their respective military and intelligence quivers, and saying, oh, that's nice. I could use that. And then, you could probably use this. And that's what the strategic partnership means at this point. When you hear military technical cooperation, it's not a joke. And it has to, I want to say it right out. Russia has supposed treaty allies in the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Kazakhstan and Belarus and others. But who has provided real military support for Russia in their time of need? Iran, not Kazakhstan, not Central Asian states, and Lukashenko just playing his usual games because he doesn't have any room left for maneuver. But the Russian-Iranian friendship alliance, I'll go that far, even if it's not a mutual defense clause declared yet. It's a military alliance. It's closer than ever, even after the Russian government got along good with Raisi, but they also appear to have good relations with Pezeshkian so far. I don't expect anything to change in that regard. Everything looks like it's only accelerating in that direction. And Russia also sees it as part of the payback they promised to the U.S. You make problems for us on what are geopolitical red lines for us. Well, then we're going to make problems for you and what are geopolitical red lines for you. And right, here's this convenient crisis going right along. And there was a CNN report just over a week ago that Russia was about to transfer anti-ship missiles to the Houthis for use against U.S. warships and possibly other Western Israeli-aligned shipping in the Red Sea. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but CNN certainly does. It's a possibility. Supposedly, Russia was talked down from that. But after these latest escalations, are they going to be talked down by anything in the future? I very much doubt it. So whereas up until 2 years ago, Russia very much tried to maintain a balanced business-like relationship with Israel, that's gone out the door in the last 2 years. I mean, the geopolitical bloc, Russia and China, and they always say we're not interested in geopolitical blocs. It doesn't matter because geopolitical blocs on the other side are interested in you, and that's forcing everyone to take a side at this point. You're either with us or you're against us. And the Americans keep saying that to everyone. Well, some people are choosing to be on the other side of that calculus. So Russia and Israel are now, Russian-Israeli relations are now very bad. And you'll notice that Abbas, the Palestinian Authority leader, was just in Moscow. Where in one of Putin's summer residences outside of Moscow, apparently him and the boss had a 3-hour sit down, which is pretty substantial. And so I really want to know, I don't expect to see Russian troops in Palestine, but Palestine also just had a meeting with China. Quite obviously, Russia and China, which had previously tried to stay above the fray on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that's out the roof, right? I mean, they're not going to they don't have the power projection to send troops or jets to defend Palestine, but obviously they are galvanizing politically the rest of the world, which is horrified by what's going on and seeing this genocidal monster, Netanyahu, received 56 standing ovations, or 58, whatever it was, from the U.S. Congress. And the rest of the world, I mean, it makes it easier for Russia to make their case in Ukraine, when they, at the same time, all of this is going on to the Palestinians. That's a little cold-blooded to say, but it's very true. And I personally can't think of anything that would help Russia more than if a major war kicked off between Israel and Iran right now, because that would mean more military assets. The U.S. can't even provide enough air defense interceptor missiles or artillery shells for the Kiev regime, much less supply them to both the Kiev regime and Israel. And while there's certainly not complete overlap of military supplies, it would be two very different conflicts. There is enough, and there is some, and particularly air defense interceptor missiles are a crucial thing there. So Russia and China very much have an interest in seeing, right? China, if U.S. gets involved in a fight against Iran in the Middle East, even if it's just long range strikes, that puts off for another year or two or three any possibility of the U.S. provoking something with China, because that's more assets being used up. So whatever they may say publicly, Russia and China are probably at some level make a calculation. Maybe there are cons as well, but certainly the argument can be made that it would be to their benefit to see the U.S. Getting bogged down in another conflict in the Middle East. They can't even play whack-a-mole successfully against the Houthis in Yemen, much less a full-scale war with Iran and the entire axis of resistance. The U.S. has been trying to avoid it, I believe, but they also can't stop supporting Israel. They just can't do it. It's politically impossible in the U.S.
Yes.
It's amazing the amount of political control, the power that AIPAC has in the U.S. Trump was just talking about it recently, about how powerful AIPAC is. He was actually saying they're not as powerful as they used to be, but he was actually speaking in very complimentary terms, because he would be an even bigger supporter, him and Vance, than Biden is, because then it wouldn't just be U.S.-Israel. It would be he also has good personal relations with Netanyahu, which Biden doesn't. So I still expect a large-scale Iranian response. I think it won't be the pantomime that it was last time. And I think Russia, in multiple ways, may be helping them prepare for it right now. So hold on to your hats. It could be a major war in the Middle East could be breaking out yet. And again, I don't think Russia and China will get directly involved, but I believe they'll very much give almost as much support to Iran as the U.S. and the West are giving to Ukraine. I mean, tit for tat, right? Proxy. You want to play proxy war? We can play proxy war too.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty astounding too, even just that all these points that you make, Mark, had me thinking too over the course of what's been happening in Gaza, right? You don't have, let's say, Netanyahu going to Moscow or Netanyahu going to Beijing and getting any kind of applauses. He doesn't even get an invite. And then you were talking about this support for Iran. I mean, you had China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, literally call the new acting foreign minister in Iran and say, we defend your right. We uphold your right to defend yourself, which is in all intents and purposes.
And I mean, when they're talking Palestine, it has to be said that Russia and China recognize a Palestinian state, as does most of the rest of the world outside of the West. Not just the people, not just a nation, but the Palestinian state, which Israel is militarily occupying and ethnic cleansing and annexing.
Yeah. So we have this alignment going on, which I think many people in the collective West who are so critical of Russia, China, and Iran don't see. But now you have the Western media.
Want to see. Yeah. They see it, but it's, no, They've got to fight over something sometime. They can't possibly
Yes.
cooperate against us. They've been saying that since 2010, 2009, 2010, when I was at the LSE. Russia and China will never cooperate long term. There's too many interests, and as wrong as horrible as the man was, and as wrong as he was about many other things, Zbigniew Brzezinski, may he rot in hell, very much talked about the emerging axis of the aggrieved. The countries that the U.S. was pissing off in their push for hegemony around the world that were growing to cooperate. Not because Russia and China and Iran have anything really in common ideologically or politically or religiously, other than a vision of a shared multipolar world not dominated by U.S.-led Western global hegemony. But turns out that's enough if you push them enough. And
well, I wanted to ask you your final comment then, Mark, on this, because in Foreign Policy Magazine, there's a really interesting recent article on how the axis of evil is overhyped. And they're talking about Russia, China, Iran, and now the DPRK, because you mentioned earlier, Mark, about Russia and the DPRK being also very much aligned militarily. So, Mark, can you correct the record here? I mean, first, we have the axis of evil rhetoric coming up again. The ghost of John Bolton never seems to go away. But talk about the reality of the situation, because what this so-called expert at the neocon rag Foreign Policy Magazine is saying is that this is all temporary, that everything is just simply bilateral. There's no
if U.S. hegemony goes away tomorrow, if they stop trying to force their will on the rest of the world, yeah, it would. But I don't think that's likely to happen. I don't think the U.S. is politically capable of giving up U.S.-led Western global hegemony. The Europeans would freak out if the U.S. They sometimes seem more, at least this slate of leaders seem more committed to it than sometimes than the U.S. does. They were so happy to have the assumed U.S. role as hegemon come back when Trump was replaced with Biden. They were like, oh, you were a little weird there for a while. You're back. Lead us. Lead us, hegemon, lead us. They were so happy to have their hegemonic master back. But this is just, again, this is that hopium and copium that they've been saying for the last 10 years. And if the obvious, China's refusing to bow to U.S. sanctions over Russia, and the rest of it has to be said, not just China, the rest of the world as well. India is not included in that, right? The language used by China or by the U.S. now against China-Russia trade is calling China a decisive enabler or something of the sort. Now, notice they don't mention India because it's too geopolitically important a pivot point for them. But actually, in terms of expansion of trade, not just the existing total of trade, but in terms of sheer growth, Russian Indian trade has jumped even more than in growth rate terms than Chinese Russian trade has jumped. So, and then the military transfer that's going on between Russia and Iran, again, both sides giving to both sides. And then if you don't think that there's intelligence sharing going on between both of them and China as well, and if they're not transferring to China everything they learn about U.S. weapons systems and tactics and everything that's going on and vice versa, I mean, I don't know what to tell you. This is hopium and copium. I would counter to this, the axis of evil is overhyped. NATO is overhyped. NATO unity, right? How unified are Hungary and Slovakia behind this proxy war going on? Yeah, how unified is NATO bitching back and forth to each other about the spending and who's spending what? And Germany's like, oh, yeah, we want to increase spending. Can we count the money we're spending on roads as military spending and just call it even? Cool. Are we cool? I mean, talk to me again about unity there. The U.S. just blew up Germany's energy pipeline, and Stockholm syndrome German leaders are parroting this. No, NATO unity, Western unity is overhyped. That's the way I would respond to this type of gibberish.
Yeah, indeed. And there's going to be a lot of more opportunities to bicker and become divided very soon, as there are now announcements about NATO aircraft carriers and naval vessels heading to the Pacific over the next year or two to build on their promise to expand all the way to China's border as well, and to China's waters. So,
and before we close off, there was one other geopolitical hot event and spot this week, and I will not talk about it because I'm so laser focused on 90% on Ukraine and 10% left over for the Middle East. I don't have time for anything else. But there has apparently been a U.S. regime change / color revolution in Bangladesh. The Bangladeshi prime minister, she has fled to India, where she has said the U.S. orchestrated her overthrow because I'm sure there always is domestic reasons to exploit as well, but because she refused to open a U.S. military base in an island off the coast of Bangladesh. And right now, the news I just saw today was, in true Maidan Putsch color regime style, her supporters coming out onto the streets for a political protest were attacked and beat with bamboo and metal sticks and rods by the revolutionary forces defending the students' revolution, as they call it, which just brings to my mind so many painful memories of the Maidan in Ukraine and what happened there. But if you want to know more about that, and I do, and I will have time to catch up on it this weekend, read Brian Berletic, because he is in Southeast Asia and he's much more all over this than I am. And I will be watching him as well. But I recognize that this was a big thing that happened this week as well.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, Mark, we've been on for a while, so it was a really good rundown of everything. I have put your Telegram and your X accounts in the video description. And I hope everyone goes and follows you there. Everybody who's still left watching, we had a really big show today. So all 7,000 plus of you, go to the video description, follow Mark's work, and of course, support this channel if you can. Patreon, Substack, PayPal, Buy Me a Coffee, and more. I want to thank all the moderators who did the show tonight. You all are great and amazing. Thank you to Shadowless Kick, Conan, and Conan, the two super chatters today. I won't pull them up, but thank you so much for your generosity. And I will be back next week and then out of here for travel after that. But Mark, do you have any final comment?
Yes, subscribe, buy Danny a coffee, or I will give you a contemptuous, withering, dismissive gaze that will haunt you for the rest of your lives.
Well, thank you, Mark, for that. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. So, everyone, have a good rest of your day. Have a good weekend. And I will be back with all of you soon. Bye-bye.
До свидания.